There's a reason why James Cameron based the movie Aliens on the Vietnam War. He wanted to depict an incredibly bloody conflict between a ferocious local force and an advanced fighting squad. In the movie, almost all of the human characters who represent the U.S. soldiers meet an incredibly gory end at the hands of the aliens. And in Vietnam, over 58,000 American soldiers were killed over the course of the conflict. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. At least 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, 849 North Vietnamese soldiers, and an unknown number of Vietnamese civilians died. Estimates of the total civilian casualties range from 225,000 to over 610,000. Clearly, anyone who spent a significant amount of time in Vietnam during the 60s or 70s, who then saw the final U.S. withdrawal, was lucky to have survived. Some of these survival stories are hard to believe, but they show how humans can overcome some of the worst conditions the world has ever known in weird, ingenious, and extremely lucky ways. For instance, one of the survival stories ahead features a pilot who had to parachute to the ground while his helmet melted into his skull. Another soldier got shot 3 times while attempting to rescue wounded men who could not walk and somehow lived to see another day. Here are some survival stories from the Vietnam War that show just how extreme the fighting conditions truly were. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the actions of the subjects featured. When Bruce DeYoung was nearing the end of his high school years, he knew what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to enlist with the U.S. Marine Corps, but his parents told him that that was impossible. They said that there was no way that he could become a part of an elite military force, or any military force, as he would always suffer from the after effects of rheumatic fever, which he had contracted 3 times at that point. Despite this, DeYoung pushed his body to the limit, somehow making himself fit enough to enlist. A few weeks after graduation, DeYoung entered basic training, not revealing his medical history or pre-existing conditions to anyone. He passed this training with flying colors. Soon, he was on a plane to Vietnam. When he arrived, a Marine doctor worked out that DeYoung had suffered from rheumatic fever in the past and that he was still coping with the disease's damage. The doctor told DeYoung to return home, as the condition would surely lead to his death on the field. But DeYoung refused outright and insisted on joining the fight. DeYoung's tour of duty initially kept him away from the battlefield, but in early 1968, that changed. He and 67 other Marines were to take part in the Battle of Khe Sanh. It started when the North Vietnamese forces conducted a huge bombardment of a Marine garrison, but not the one where DeYoung was based. When President Johnson heard about the bombardment, he ordered that under no circumstances should it be abandoned. So the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces struck back, destroying as many North Vietnamese bases as they could. Naturally, the North Vietnamese tried to attack again. DeYoung and the 67 others were flown in to defend the base. The Marines saw the North Vietnamese approach and braced to defend themselves. Hundreds of soldiers began attacking the Marines, tearing them apart with guns and grenades. DeYoung was standing next to a fellow officer and saw him get riddled with bullets. Somehow, DeYoung did not get hit once. He dived into nearby bushes and looked around. Explosions littered the area. Fellow Marines lost arms and legs and tried to crawl to safety. DeYoung, who was a devout Mormon, prayed to God to make his death quick. Then, according to DeYoung, he heard a voice say, "No, it's not your time yet." DeYoung looked around and noticed an enemy trench. He realized that this would be his only chance of survival and dived inside. To his surprise, DeYoung saw that 5 other Marines had also hidden in the trench. They looked up and saw North Vietnamese soldiers approaching, fast. The Marines had no choice but to flee. That was when they reached a cliff edge with a river at the base. The only options were to jump or to get shot. DeYoung and the 5 others jumped. Luckily, the river was deep enough for the men to land without breaking their bones. They let the stream carry them away from the battlefield. When the sounds of battle had died down, DeYoung and the others swam ashore. They radioed in for help, and soon a helicopter had recovered them. Back at base, DeYoung learned that he was one of only 10 survivors. 58 of the men in his unit had died. DeYoung knew that he could use his medical condition to return home, but he felt guilty about leaving the battlefield and was determined to prove himself. So he volunteered to go deep behind enemy lines and provide reconnaissance work. DeYoung was then given a charge of 5 men, who boarded a helicopter and headed for what seemed like certain death. As they flew into enemy territory, the rain started lashing down. DeYoung and the others had no way of knowing this, but the enemy soldiers were even more determined to kill them than they usually would have been, as the North Vietnamese military was offering a reward of a year's pay for any American that one of their soldiers shot. The helicopter, it made a terrible mistake. It flew too close to an enemy base. The pilot, without realizing his mistake, then dropped the men off and flew away. Soon, North Vietnamese soldiers were marching through the 7-foot-tall grass that the Marines had landed within. DeYoung heard the approaching soldiers and ordered his men to stay put. They were all heavily camouflaged, so they stayed as still as statues as the rain beat down, waiting for death. Then he saw a rifle emerge through the grass. DeYoung's heart pounded against his chest, but he remained as still as a statue, as did the other men. The enemy soldier was just feet from the Americans, but thanks to the camouflage and the storm, the soldier would not make them out. He turned around at the last second and marched away, investigating another area. The soldiers slowly breathed a sigh of relief when they saw another rifle poke through the grass. Once more, the men braced themselves for action, and the enemy soldier moved on, following the same path as the last one. A third rifle appeared from the grass. Once more, the soldier failed to see them and marched on. DeYoung's military radio, which was connected to headphones that he was wearing, relayed a message. The military base told DeYoung to click once if they were safe and click twice if they were in danger. DeYoung clicked twice. Soon, a heavily armored American plane began flying above them. The North Vietnamese soldiers knew that if they shot at any Americans, the plane would know where they were and would rain a hail of gunfire upon them. Still, DeYoung and the men waited, knowing that if they moved, they risked death. When the dawn broke, 6 American helicopters flew above them. The helicopters started pouring machine gun fire in front of the Marines, ensuring that the area was clear. One of these helicopters landed. DeYoung and the others climbed aboard. They were flown back to safety. DeYoung continued to serve, somehow surviving the war. He returned home and kept his survival story to himself until 2014, when a local journalist in his hometown finally interviewed him. When Gary Rodgers signed up for the Marine Corps in 1966, he ended up becoming a combat engineer and demolitions expert. Those who were unfamiliar with the Vietnamese battlefield couldn't believe that someone as short as him had been selected for the job. But Rodgers' shortness was perfect for one reason. He was able to crawl into incredibly narrow tunnels. While the taller Marines waited, Rodgers would have to scramble inside a hole as fast as possible to make his way deep under the ground to find and deactivate mines. And it wasn't just explosives that threatened him. The North Vietnamese often booby-trapped these tunnels, meaning that Rodgers had to carefully yet rapidly examine every inch of space. One of the most common forms of booby trap was to tie tiny bamboo viper snakes to walls. These vipers were so venomous that if Rodgers had been bitten by one of them, then he would have been dead in approximately 15 seconds. Because of this rapid death time, the soldiers called them three-steppers, as most people, after being bitten, would only be able to manage to walk 3 incredibly painful steps before dropping dead.
There's booby traps in there. They have, there's a snake over there called a bamboo viper, about that big, and they tie them to the wall. And if you get bit by one, we used to call them three-steppers. You got about 15 seconds. And you're dead.
The fact that Rodgers managed to continually clear tunnels without being exploded, poisoned, or otherwise killed is miraculous enough in itself. But would his luck run out? Rodgers and his unit had been sent to secure what the military termed Hill 41, approximately 13 miles southeast of Da Nang. He and his fellow soldiers approached the hill and were shocked to see that it appeared to be empty. So they cautiously walked across the meadow in front of the hill when they heard machine gun fire. The men ducked and looked around. 3 heavy machine gunners had hidden on one side of this meadow. Rodgers then looked on the opposite side. There were another 3 heavily camouflaged machine gun units firing at them. The men all ran for the nearest cover. Amazingly, Rodgers made it to safety. Then he looked back at the meadow and saw that one of his fellow soldiers had been hit and was bleeding out on the ground. Without pausing for thought, Rodgers ran back into the crossfire, determined to rescue the fallen soldier. Rodgers made it to the soldier, grabbed his collar, and dragged him, knowing that a bullet could down him at any moment. Rodgers knew that he couldn't drag this person all the way back to where the other men were. Instead, their only hope was a small bomb crater that was just about deep enough to hide them from the shooters. Rodgers was just a couple of feet away and was beginning to think he was going to make it when he felt a stinging pain in his knee. A bullet had torn right through his kneecap. Rodgers fell, but kept a hold of the downed soldier. With all his might, he pulled his own body along the ground with one arm and kept his grip firm on the wounded soldier with his other. He reached the crater's edge and threw himself and the wounded man over the edge. Rodgers was now in excruciating pain. Still, he crawled up to the edge of the crater to monitor the situation. He saw that another American soldier was on the ground and didn't have the strength to move. He took one look back at the man he had just dragged to safety to make sure he was all right, and threw himself back above the crater once more. Rodgers then hobbled as fast as he could to the other soldier. He picked up his second wounded soldier and made his way back to the crater. Again, when he was just a few feet away from the crater's edge, he felt another surge of pain. This bullet hit his other knee. He screamed out in pain, and then a third bullet hit. Losing strength, Rodgers wrapped his arms around the other soldier and dived backwards, falling into the crater. Soon, Rodgers passed out. He thought he was never going to regain consciousness. But then he heard the sounds of people talking frantically. He was able to open his eyes and see that he was in a U.S. Army field hospital. His wounds had been treated, and he was still somehow alive. The doctor said that he was incredibly lucky to be alive. The first thing out of Rodgers' mouth was to ask about the 2 men he had dragged out of harm's way. The doctors, well, they had good news and bad news. One of the men was currently recovering in the hospital. The other had succumbed to his wounds. Rodgers would have nightmares about this experience for over 10 years. On August 12, 1972, U.S. Air Force pilot Joseph Talon was flying an OV-1 Mohawk plane over enemy territory, performing reconnaissance work with technical observer Daniel Richards. To ensure that they could observe the terrain effectively, the plane lowered altitude to just 200 feet. A North Vietnamese unit spotted the plane. Unfortunately for the Americans, this unit was outfitted with anti-aircraft missile launchers. The unit sent missiles into the air. Talon rushed into evasive maneuvers, but the sky was filled with the missiles. One of them struck the plane's wing, right where one of the engines were, tearing this engine to shreds. Talon looked to the wing and saw flames. He tried to keep the plane straight, but he couldn't stop it from slowly losing altitude. Talon did what he could do to get the plane higher, constantly fighting against gravity. Then the pilot spotted an Allied airfield in the distance. He told Richards to hang on. As Talon approached the airfield, the wing started falling apart. The plane was turning upside down. Now Talon had to fight to get the plane upright before it reached the airfield. With the plane half upside down, Talon saw a bright light and felt intense heat. What was left of the engine had just exploded. Talon realized that if he and Richards remained in the cockpit, they would both burn to death before they reached the ground. So he tried his hardest to pull the plane upright, and they both ejected. Talon pulled the string and his parachute opened. He looked over to Richards, who appeared to fall even more rapidly to the ground. An optical illusion caused by Richards falling at the same speed as Talon slowed under the parachute. Talon looked down and saw Richards struggling to open the parachute cord, but Talon couldn't focus. He was feeling more and more pain in his head. He reached for his helmet, attempting to pull it off. His hands burned at this touch. He realized that the helmet was melting through his skin and fusing into his skull. The chin strap was also slowly oozing into his face skin, making it even more impossible for him to tear the helmet off. Then Talon landed. He screamed in pain until the heat from the helmet died down, but it was still fused to his head. He looked around and saw the body of Richards. Sadly, he passed after his parachute failed. Talon tried to work out where he was. For a moment, he was confused. He saw that many spots on the ground had been disturbed. That was when it all made horrifying sense. Talon was lying in the middle of a minefield. Talon attempted to stand, but the pain in his head made him fall. He realized that if he tried to walk, he would almost definitely end up landing on a mine. So he slowly dragged himself to the perimeter fence of the airbase that he had been unable to land in. He kept on pausing, with the burns on top of his skull constantly threatening to make him lose focus. Somehow, Talon managed to avoid every single mine and get to the perimeter fence. He reached out to the fence, immediately struck his finger on barbed wire, and jerked back. Soon, soldiers spotted him and did their best to reach him safely. Eventually, a medical unit reached him and slowly carried him on a stretcher out of the minefield. At the hospital, the doctors worked tirelessly to remove all the pieces of the helmet from Talon's skull. They told Talon that parts of the helmet had reached 7,000 degrees. They could not believe that he had maintained consciousness long enough to open his parachute and drag himself through a minefield. Talon went on to become a history teacher. Eventually, he petitioned for the U.S. Army to award the soldier that didn't make it out of the crash alive, Richards, a posthumous Purple Heart. The Army granted that request. How do you feel about some of the ways people survived the Vietnam War? Tell us in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching Nutty History.